You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
This opportunity was about the power that podcasting has to include diverse voices. And we started Africa Podfest as a way to bring communities together. We can't simply take the model that exists in other parts of the world and assume it would work here. The future African media it reflects the people of Africa a lot more than it does in the present. In a lot of countries, media is still very heavily regulated and policed by political regimes. Wouldn't it be cool to have a podcast in every single language?
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have another special guest, Melissa Mbugua, who is Co-Director of Africa Podfest, which is an organization that inspires and elevates podcasters in Africa who are looking to create and grow their podcasts. Welcome to the podcast, Melissa. How are you?
Thank you so much, Teresa. I am doing great. I'm very excited to be a guest. Also, your podcast, Unlocking Africa, is certainly up my alley. So I'm doing good and I'm excited to be here.
Fantastic. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. So I usually like to start from the beginning, so I was hoping you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Melissa Mbugua.
Great. So I'm Melissa Mbugua. I am Kenyan and based in Nairobi. I view the world as a global space. The world is my oyster. I really like to work with global communities. So I am an innovator, an entrepreneur in the cultural space, hyper-specifically in media. I have a background in technology, in business, in international development, and I really do have a passion for the arts and culture because that's really what shows us who we are as humans to each other. And arts and culture is kind of our collective consciousness. So I have a real passion for the next generation of media industries as empowered and enabled by the internet, which is how I'm now here, which is how I've ended up here working in the podcast space to build up the foundations of an African podcasting industry that is relevant in the future.
Fantastic. So you've given us a nice insight into who you are in terms of your passion for working with the global community, arts, culture, and media. As I mentioned in my intro, you are Co-Director of Africa Podfest. So I was hoping you could tell us a bit more about the organization, how the idea came about, and what you hope or aim to achieve through the organization.
Yes. So Africa Podfest is led by myself and my co-director, Josephine Karianjahi, who is also Kenyan and based in Germany. So we've been friends actually for a very long time and share this passion for inclusion, for society that is vibrant, artistically, culturally connected. And we also share definitely the community-centered approach to doing things. So as we were, just kind of talking about opportunities for the future, the topic of media and specifically podcasting kept coming up. This is a few years ago, maybe 6 years ago. And at the time, I was running a consultancy supporting creative industry organizations here in Kenya. And I had started to do some, very informal, I would say, research into podcasting and how that was developing across the continent. And so, sort of the more we talked to different people, including podcasters, including media practitioners and audiences, the more we realized there was something here in terms of the unique offering that podcasting provides for the African context, even though it still wasn't largely known on the continent as a medium. And this opportunity was about the power that podcasting has to include diverse voices, voices from all corners, and voices that are expressed in their own way, unfiltered, if I may say.
Yes.
Language-wise, style-wise, whatever story people want to tell, and in a way that really hasn't been experienced before, I don't think, at least in Africa, in the media space. And the fact that podcasts can be taken up by, literally speaking, by anybody with a phone.
Yes.
With a phone that has recording functionality. So the fact that it's accessible to anybody with a phone, regardless of their training or background, and is also accessible to the most resourced, trained, and skilled media professional within a media institution, is something pretty special and powerful. And we started Africa Podfest as a way to bring communities together, these early podcasting communities and the early experimenters, the early audiences as well, to figure it out together, as it were, to figure out, so what can the industry look like? What are the opportunities to build an industry that works for Africa? Because again, we can't simply take the model that exists in other parts of the world and assume it would work here because of different challenges, such as, for example, infrastructure, so, for example, internet infrastructure is moving in a different way in Africa, accessibility, things like digital payments, things like trade agreements across countries. There are so many different unique contextual factors to take into consideration,
Yes.
even just the way business works, So like, what would sponsorship or advertising models look like here? So that's why our approach was to start by bringing people together. So we are a community-first organization. And our main activities are community gatherings, especially our flagship festival, Africa Podcast Day, every year on February 12th. We also do community-centered research. And we do also do like advisory and podcast incubation in the ecosystem. That's the summary. And our goal, our aim is to see a financially sustainable and inclusive podcast industry in Africa.
Amazing. Thank you for that. So you've given us great insights into the journey of Africa Podfest and why you started it with your co-director. As you mentioned in your intro, you're extremely active in African media. And I read somewhere, I think it was on your LinkedIn profile, that you're on a mission to build a new African media. So from your perspective, what does the new African media look like to you?
Yes, something I didn't mention in my intro is that I also going back, is that I also am a director at an independent film festival called the Nairobi Film Festival. Right, it's a small indie fest, and what that festival does is bring contemporary, like the latest in African film, to Kenyan audiences. And I say this to connect because film is also media, podcasting is media.
Yes.
It's all about storytelling. To me, the future African media it reflects the people of Africa a lot more than it does in the present. And this is to say, because it's decentralized, then one, it's much wider, much more vibrant, much bigger. It's very difficult to kind of capture in one box. Second, there's something for everyone. For example, no matter what language you speak, so if you speak Zulu, there's content across as many topics and themes and subjects, from hard news to like narrative fiction in Zulu, and so on and so forth. So no matter the device you're using, there is content available for you. So to me, the future of media in Africa just looks it's decentralized,
yes,
it's diverse, and it looks like the African people. It represents and mirrors the diversity and the interestingness of African people.
Awesome. So you've mentioned there that the new African media is decentralized and it reflects the diversity of African people in the present. So I guess looking at that from the other perspective, how would you describe the current shape of African media?
The current shape of African media is still very much decentralized and top-down because it's very much dependent on who has access to resources, In a lot of countries, media is still very heavily regulated and policed by government and by political regimes. So media is not necessarily free in a way that is representative of the people, but it's more along the spectrum where media represents what is acceptable by the regime of the time, what is allowed, so to speak. Media currently also is not necessarily meeting the needs of audiences and also of industry or business communities. By this, I mean advertising, for example,
yes,
is so expensive. It's too expensive for most businesses on the continent, which are like small and medium sized. They can't afford the rates to advertise on big radio, big TV, print, etc. And then at the same time, also audiences are just not feeling served, represented, seen. There's just so much that has not been tapped into yet in the media space. I will say, though, because of how internet accessibility and the internet is changing the game, so it's a lot more diversified now and becoming more and more decentralized. However, media still looks like socioeconomic inequality.
Very true.
Yeah, so the people you see on YouTube are the people who have the resources, the skills to be able to access Wi-Fi connectivity and video equipment and training and so on. It's still very much unequal.
You've raised some interesting points there, and you also detailed that the current African media is still very centralized, top-down, and not very representative of the people. So I guess, as we're here to talk about podcasting, what part, if any, does podcasting play in the development of the new media in Africa?
Yeah, so one, because of, relatively speaking, how easily accessible podcasting is compared to other forms of storytelling and of media, it's just by default already open to people across the socioeconomic spectrum, regardless of background and so on, as long as you have access to a phone and internet. But even then, a phone and data access is a lot more accessible than a camera and Wi-Fi, So that's why I said relatively much more accessible than any other form of media. So it's already, just by its existence, potentially decentralizing the media space. Secondly, is its distribution format. It's free to distribute. Of course, there are paid tiers and so on, paid options, but it's free to distribute and it goes all over the world instantly. And as yet, there isn't much gatekeeping that has come into the podcast space. Podcasting is still operating within that early stage window where really anything is possible. What is possible, we always tell this to podcasters, what's possible is what you manage to do.
That's actually an interesting take. I agree 100%.
Yeah, right now we're in the early stages, right? Before it then attracts regulation. Another aspect of it is, I think, just because of and our research has also shown this, is that because of the freedom in the formatting of podcasting, nobody's telling you what to do. And so within the bounds of your own imagination, your daring, your own skills, and what you're able to do, you can tell stories in whichever format, in whatever language, using whatever sounds that work for your audience. And you can build your audience using whatever methods are available to you. So it also decentralizes audiences. So it's a real big move podcasting is very different from the model of we all tune in to listen to a particular radio show, or we're all glued to a particular platform for watching video. Podcasting turns that around to, I by myself have this selection of programs I listen to in my own time. And it's limitless, really. It can be, I can even have my own secret hobbies, and I have podcasts that feed that interest. For example, if you're into knitting and no one else, or you'd never dare say in public that you're into knitting, there are podcasts for you,
That's very true.
So, so it also decentralizes the audience in that sense. I always figure, if you put 1,000 podcasts together and look at who the audience is, who the audiences are, it's a lot more interesting, I think, than if you put the most popular shows in mainstream media or like, let's say, YouTube or Netflix together and saw who the audience is.
Interesting. So you emphasize that podcasting is obviously relatively accessible, it's open, and it's also a relatively new medium in Africa. So I'm assuming finding reliable information and data can be a challenge. So at Africa Podfest, how have you gone about gathering reliable data so that the work that you're doing can be measured and quantified and you can produce the reports that you do produce?
Yes, so that's a huge, huge piece that we found was missing in the space, is that how do podcasters, but also ecosystem players, so even, big media or potential funders, supporters, investors in the media space, where do they get reliable information about what's going on in podcasting as an industry? And we figured that because we have access to the community that's on the ground in different countries that actually doing the work and that has the information, the data on their audiences, on their methods and how they're making money, etc. And we also have access to audiences directly because they trust Africa Podfest as this community hub. We really leverage that, the fact that we are a community-centered organization to gather information from our community, which, it's based on actually the trust relationship. So we gather information, which we then share freely and openly. It's open access. All our reports are open access on our website, and they're accessible to anyone around the world, from the biggest media giants or tech giants to the lone independent podcaster who feels like they're very far away from the community can access the same report. We feel we still have quite a journey to go in terms of accessibility, for example, of our research reports. For example, in language, so far our material is in English. And to us, that's only the beginning, so we know it needs to be in as many languages as possible. And this knowledge needs to spread as far and wide as the podcasting industry has potential to grow.
Fantastic. So if we can just focus on the report, what type of person is the report intended for? Is it intended for your podcaster in terms of your independent podcasters? Is it intended for your large corporate organizations and potential sponsors? Who is the report intended for?
Our primary audience that we have in mind for the reports when we're crafting them is the podcaster. So it's for the podcaster first, and then for the podcast industry organization second, for that person sitting in a media organization or an ad agency or who works at a brand that's potentially looking to work with podcasters. That's the secondary audience, but the primary audience is podcasters themselves.
Fantastic. So if we look at, the content of the report, what are some of the broad themes covered in the report? And if you can just give us a bit more detail in terms of why you felt those themes were relevant or should be the key focus of the report.
Well, within the scope of the resources and the time that we had available for us, especially for our latest set of reports, which we released between 2021 and 2022, are focused on understanding what's driving podcast audience growth and who the African podcast audience is. And secondly, in understanding what's driving podcasters. So on the supply side and then on the demand side.
Okay.
And then in between, we also did literature review to understand and document what's the context of African podcasting in terms of the global podcast industry. That's one review we did, literature review we released. And the second piece was also an assessment of policy frameworks, especially in Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria, being the three currently largest podcast markets on the continent. So our audience research, environmental studies have focused on these three countries for now. And that's not to say that those are the only countries where podcasting is happening or where podcasting will grow, but they are currently the forerunners on the continent.
Thank you for that, Melissa. So you mentioned one of the themes the report looked at what is driving the podcast growth and podcasters in Africa. So in your opinion, why has podcasting become so popular in Africa in recent years?
Certainly, from what we've heard back from audiences, it's because of the relevance of the content and the style that it's presented in. So it's about that issue that I had mentioned earlier about representation. So it's because audiences are finally seeing themselves and their interests represented through podcasts, and they're feeling a sense of fresh narratives, a fresh opportunity to connect with other Africans or with people even in my own city or my country who would be otherwise harder to find.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's that sense of a need that's being served, a need for types of stories, types of content, and delivered in styles that really resonate with the audiences. And the audiences find that these are not the content that's otherwise in traditional media isn't really meeting this need. And interestingly, actually, I can give an example from one of our reports, is that the most popular themes, at least in Kenya, among audiences are culture, wellness, issues to do with political awareness, not necessarily political news, but diving deeper into politics and policies.
Okay.
Did I say arts? Arts, which is very different from what the top line, most popular themes in the mainstream media are, which are politics, current affairs, news, sports. So that's interesting, right? That was surprising for us as well. It just proved that there's a whole underserved market in the media space.
Awesome. So you've detailed that the growth is driven by relevant style, representation, and fresh narratives created by podcasters. So with this growth, I wanted to understand, what are the challenges that African podcasters face that you wouldn't necessarily experience outside of the continent? I think you touched on this slightly at the beginning of the conversation, but I was hoping we could go into more detail.
Yes, there's several layers of challenge. So I'll say one is infrastructural, just because, things like power cuts happen a lot in Africa compared to other parts of the world.
Yes.
Also, just the cost of internet access is quite high, and generally the cost of equipment. So even the smartphone is not something that is, would come by easily to many Africans to get, like a really good smartphone. It's a big investment, right?
Yes.
So much less a full kit, a full studio kit, podcasting kit. So there's definitely that challenge, just of access to infrastructure. And then close to that is also access to capacity, skills, knowledge that is Africa relevant,
yes,
which is a gap that we and many other, especially country level podcast communities have set out to plug that gap. So nowadays, if you search the internet, you find a lot more Africa relevant podcast content, podcast kind of knowledge. But there's still space for a lot more. And then thirdly, now so if you've solved for podcasters who have managed to overcome the infrastructure barrier, the skills barrier and capacity barrier, the community barrier, and are now in the market, they have a growing audience, and they have a machine going, a podcast production machine going. The biggest challenge that they're facing, and this is collective across the board, regardless of country, is this route to commercialization or route to money.
Yes.
To financial sustainability. And the reasons for that are not necessarily because it's not about there not being opportunities or it's not that there are no budgets available. It's that also because it's new, podcasting is still relatively new on the continent. And so from an industry perspective, brands, businesses, ad agencies, and so on have not yet fully grasped how to go about taking advantage of podcasting as an opportunity. So, for example, some of the commercial side potential advertising people we spoke to during our research said, yes, they can see the potential for podcasts, and they do have some kind of point of reference because they're used to working with social media influencers, for example. Then again, podcasting is quite different from social media influencing, right? Because it's a different game.
Yes.
But there's no framework that exists for them to measure return on investment? How will they know right now? Like, there's no place where they can go and ask or find out which are the podcasts I should invest in. It's that infrastructure for the business side of things still hasn't been developed yet. And it's one of the reasons, again, bringing the community together to build that infrastructure. Somebody has to do it, right?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah. So that's one issue. And then the other side is to do actually with, for example, tech. So to be able to generate revenue at scale and to be able to, for both the podcasters and also the business or ad side of things, for them to be able to easily and in a measurable, accountable way, be able to work together, there'd be need for some certain infrastructure on the tech front, which would be one, payments, which is developing in Africa. So there's a lot of fintech development going on. But, there's still gaps to be filled, especially in this media and entertainment space. So it's still relatively difficult to move money online across Africa. And then secondly is also the tech that would allow, for example, for ad bookings and so on, which does exist in other markets, the global north, but it's not quite built for Africa yet. So that's also a gap.
Okay, thank you for that, Melissa. So I guess in addition to, say, Africa Podfest, are there any online or offline communities, ecosystems or incubators that are supporting African podcasters to navigate these challenges?
Yes, there definitely, I would say actually almost every country that has a podcast scene does have some community organized around it. So, for example, in Nigeria, there's the Niger Pod Hub community, as an example, that do host. They have a directory, they do trainings, workshops, and so on. There's a community in South Africa called Pod Meets. There's an organization called Radio Workshop that's based out of South Africa, but that does training for podcasters across the continent, virtually. There's an organization called Legally Clueless Africa, which actually came up out of a podcast that has really grown, and now they've developed a course.
Oh, wow.
For podcasters, and they're teaching it actually even in universities. But they also do open calls for any podcaster who wants to take the course. There's a community in Zambia, community in Zimbabwe, in Kenya as well. There are a number of podcast hubs. So yes, there is quite a lot of action happening locally. And the interesting thing about this is that most of these hubs and communities did not exist 3 years ago.
So it's all relatively new.
Yes, it's all relatively new, and it's all amazingly riding on existing kind of creative and innovation hubs. So, for example, a lot of these podcast hubs and communities work out of studios that already existed or out of innovation spaces or creative arts centers and hubs that already existed. So podcasting as a new development is building on the existing creativity and innovation scene, which brings together tech and media, which is also a really cool cross-pollination of communities that we can see happening.
So you've detailed there the creative and innovative ways that offline and online communities are engaging or kind of getting together to support podcasters. Earlier on, you mentioned that obviously African podcasters are finding it difficult to monetize their podcasts. But for the ones who are monetizing their podcasts, what innovative ways are they using to monetize their podcasts?
Yeah, one of the most innovative ways that we've seen succeed has to do actually with who they're approaching and who they're building relationships with. So some podcasters who we've spoken to and who talk about this side of their work have talked about looking at their environment, at their markets, and targeting businesses that they know have money and have budget, have marketing budgets that they can afford to allocate, even as an experiment, to a podcast, but they're not your obvious kind of usual suspects or very high, particularly highly visible brands and so on. So that's worked. And again, that goes back to what the opportunity is. It's the opportunity of podcasting, which is about serving the underserved markets that media hasn't yet reached. So the ones we've seen succeed do that. The other approach we've seen is just going very hyper creative and very super community focused in terms of their promotion. So doing local events, like live shows, for example, or meets and greets in a way that doesn't necessarily follow the format of your shiny, swanky media event that costs a lot, but that just meets the audience where they are, and takes advantage of relationships for barter, for non-monetary, but still high-value partnerships with venues, with brands, with people in studios and so on to build up and demonstrate value and to do their proof of concept and then kind of build on from there using relationships that they already have access to, but perhaps they hadn't leveraged those relationships in this way.
Thank you for that. So you've detailed the creative and engaging ways people are monetizing their podcasts. So I guess you can't really monetize a podcast without first increasing awareness and growing the listenership of your podcast. So I was wondering, what innovative ways are you seeing African podcasters use to build awareness of their podcast?
Yeah, one interesting one definitely is using WhatsApp as a distribution tool.
Yes.
Like literally as there's the layer of you share the link to the podcast, let's say on whatever app using WhatsApp, but I'm talking about like literally just sharing the audio itself as voice notes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, so that method is quite interesting. And also Telegram. Now that Telegram is becoming more and more popular. Of course, the huge advantage of using voice notes is that they'll reach a lot more people because they immensely save on data. And then also WhatsApp is huge as a trusted channel for social communication, right? Actually, I think WhatsApp is like Africa's biggest social media app.
It actually is. Funny enough, I created an article not long ago regarding business in Africa. It was more from the perspective of international trade development and also the marketing aspect. And I touched upon how important it is to access new customers in Africa through WhatsApp. But that's a whole different conversation. But yeah. WhatsApp is king in Africa.
Yes, for sure. WhatsApp is king in Africa. So yes, voice notes are certainly by far the most interesting, innovative way we've seen. The downside to it is that, it's very difficult to track how far the content goes. There's that downside. The other innovative way we've seen is actually going back to radio. So syndicating content on radio, and including community radio. Yeah, so there's some podcasters, and I think the appetite actually from the radio side for podcast syndication is starting to gradually build. Also, radio can also see that the audience is moving more towards podcasting. So if they want to retain them on their platform, then it also is an advantage to syndicate popular podcasts, especially for the Gen Z audience. Radio partnerships is an interesting one.
Earlier on, you mentioned the growth is driven by relevant style representation and fresh narratives that are very much African. So if we look deeper into this, from your opinion or your perspective, what is the importance of Africans telling their own authentic African stories?
Ooh, it goes deep, right?
Yes. We might need a whole episode for this answer.
Yes. Well, it's very important because first, our storytelling and how Africans tell their own stories is how we shape our identity and define our identity. And also how we see each other as Africans, how we get to understand better across borders in Africa. And it's how we talk to each other,
yes,
right? Collectively. And so that connection and that talking to each other and refining and redefining our identity is the basis on which trade and other, further development happens. So to me, it's very, very fundamental. It's foundational. Storytelling is foundational to everything else that we hope in terms of prosperity for the African continent, for African people across the world, around the world, diaspora as well. Also, that there's so much opportunity for connection, growth, development, prosperity, all the wonderful words, we use for what we hope for Africa. there's so much opportunity in connecting diaspora and those on the continent, right?
Yes.
And storytelling and narrative building is that foundational form of exchange between us as communities, as diverse as we are, as geographically separated as we are. I think whenever it comes to one thing we Africans have in common, is this hope and desire for this brighter future for us collectively as Africans. That has never died out, I don't think. Yeah. So that's why for us, podcasting excites us so much, because it's a really feasible, right here, right now opportunity for us to take towards what is to come.
I agree. And a great example of that is our conversation today. I'm in the UK, yes. You're in Kenya, so the African diaspora coming together to collaborate.
Exactly. Isn't it amazing? And then I get to listen to Unlocking Africa, where I really get to hear how other people working in Africa and other Africans are thinking about the continent. When would I ever have had the opportunity to really hear what people are thinking and to know who these people are, if it wasn't for the podcast platform, the podcast medium? Yeah.
100%. Something that you touched on there, which is quite key, and I love it, is that our stories are our identity. Storytelling is foundation and connecting Africans globally and pulling us all together like we are today. So I guess to confirm that, so what do you believe is the true power of podcasting in Africa?
Oh, the true power of podcasting in Africa is actually that. It's connecting each other, connecting Africans around the world to each other, and defining who we want to be. And it's very, I used the word deep earlier. It's deep. It's that soft power in just knowing ourselves and deciding for ourselves who it is that we are and who we want to be collectively. I think that's the true power. Really, that's the power that's at the core of podcasting.
I agree 100%. So I guess you've been in this space for a while now in terms of podcasting. So during your time in the African podcasting scene, how has it evolved or diversified in that period?
Oh, yes. So it's diversified, one, in terms of going beyond the big city hubs, beyond the Nairobi, Lagos, Johannesburg, Cape Town. It's now spreading even in these countries to smaller cities, smaller urban centers. And with that also, it's evolving in terms of language as more and more people take up podcasting, and as they realize that actually there's no gatekeeper and you don't need permission. People are like, oh, so I don't have to be this finely trained journalist who speaks great English or French. They're like, oh, I can just speak in my Sheng, Pidgin, whatever language, and speak to my people the way I feel most comfortable. So there's a language evolution, there's a geographical spread evolution beyond the hubs, the big hubs. There's also thematic evolution. Just as more and more people, again, take on podcasting, then we start to see themes popping up and different styles and so on popping up in a way that reflects who the podcasters are. And then in terms of industry, development, we're also seeing more tech coming up, tech platforms that are, homegrown or, made by Africans for Africans starting to come up. And we've heard of some that are even yet to come in 2023, 2024 that are in the pipeline. So that's interesting to see how that space will evolve. And then, of course, as also there are the big international players coming to the market, that's also shaping the game. And the other change that we're starting to see is, or from our perspective at Africa Podfest that we can see, is a lot more interest from radio, big radio, let me call it that, and a curiosity. And
I like the phrase big radio.
Yeah, big radio. So from legacy media, being curious and starting to, participate a little more and pay more attention to podcasts, just as the wave continues to grow.
So you detailed there that podcasting in Africa has evolved by spreading outside the main African hubs. We're seeing diversification of languages, thematics, industry development, and big international players entering the market. I read recently that you've teamed up with Spotify to invest in new African content creators. I mean, that's amazing news, but I was wondering, how did this come about and what does it mean for African podcasters or content creators?
Yeah, oh, that's an exciting update because it's the first podcast dedicated fund that's come into the African scene. The Africa Podcast Fund, and what it is $100,000 that has been granted to 13 podcasters from across different Anglophone and Francophone speaking countries. And what these podcasts have in common is that they've demonstrated potential for growth. So they already have, very strong high quality content. They have really strong core audiences, and they're clearly on the path to growth. So it's really exciting. And it came about just through lengthy discussions with Spotify and also, them understanding, also taking time to understand what the landscape in Africa looks like right now, and the shape that it takes, or it looks like it's going to take, in terms of diversity, and what's needed really in order to make it, to move it from early stage, in business, in the way, like in investment jargon, how they say, how do you move it from like that seed stage pre-revenue to like a proven business model? And how to do that is to invest in the most highly likely podcasts to succeed, the ones that show the greatest potential, and then kind of give them the support and the resources they need, and then see how that takes shape. And so we're very excited to see over the course of the next year how these 13 podcasts will evolve, because for sure what we learn from them and what we see from them and the impact they'll have will really shape the direction of the industry, just in terms of proving that yes, this is a sustainable, financially sustainable industry.
That's great news. You've detailed your partnership with Spotify, which is amazing. And this is, I guess, extremely encouraging news for current and future African podcasting. So I guess with that in mind, what other developments or trends in African podcasting are you most excited about right now?
I'm honestly really excited about the language diversification trend.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, and that diversification also going outside of podcasters outside of the main hubs taking up the mic, so to speak, because that just opens up a whole new level of conversation and
yes.
potential and yeah. So it's the language side of it for me that's really, really the most exciting. Wouldn't it be cool to have a podcast in every single language that is spoken on that continent?
That would be amazing. Yeah. That's something that I look forward to hearing, just as you mentioned, the diversification in terms of the languages that are being used, people being proud of their mother tongue. And I think it's one of the ways where we can actually retain and pass on our native languages.
Exactly. And a lot of podcasts, by the way, are about documenting African history.
Yes.
So absolutely, that's another really strong pull for local language podcasts.
So I guess with that in mind, in terms of current trends looking forward, where do you see podcasting in Africa in, say, 5 years' time?
Oh, in 5 years' time, things are changing so fast.
Yes.
I stopped thinking. A part of me stopped thinking in those long term. However, I think podcasts, but also audio in general, is going to be an actual industry that has all these foundational pieces of infrastructure in existence. Like I was saying earlier, like the tech that's needed for business transactions to happen, for payments to happen. I foresee from where I'm standing right now, I think there'll be a lot more investment in that direction. We are for sure going to have our big celebrity African podcasters who will be like big names in the world
yes,
because
that
of
would
their
be
podcast.
good to see.
Yeah, that's going to have happened for sure in the next 5 years. And we're going to be having a different kind of conversation where we'll be saying, oh my goodness, there's so many podcasts in so many languages tackling so many themes. What's next? In terms of how do we organize this, or how do you organize ourselves in the pod industry? I think also because connectivity is on the rise with the new undersea cables that are going to come live, the digital space is just on its upward trajectory. There's just going to be lots more content online coming from Africa and made for Africans. And just the way the fintech and tech innovation space is moving, I think we'll see more. Well, also currently there's a global economic crisis happening. So my caveat to all this is, and the world is changing so much. So who knows?
But as I always say, during hard times always comes some of the best innovations.
Exactly.
So we might see some of the best innovations coming out of these most challenging times.
Exactly. And from the most unlikely places.
Very
when
true.
Things are not following when it's not business as usual, then it's more interesting in that way.
Thank you for that. I am very optimistic as well with regards to the future of podcasting in Africa. And, as being a podcaster myself, it's great to have conversations with yourself, someone who's very well embedded in the podcasting scene in Africa. So looking closer to home, where do you see yourself in Africa Podfest in 5 years' time?
Oh, definitely doing a lot more, having done a lot more research. So building that body of knowledge, connecting locally with communities a lot more. And, God willing, with the festival having become the annual festival on Africa Podcast Day, having become an institution,
Yes.
like a standard in the industry. That's my hope for the next 5 years for Africa Podcast.
Awesome. I'm sure you will achieve all of that and more in terms of what you've achieved so far with the festival, your authority within the space, your new partnership with Spotify. You've actually set yourself an extremely high benchmark with partnerships with Spotify. So the only way is further up. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys do in the next 5 years.
Thank you.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or even affirmations that keep us going when times are hard or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Yes. So the one that comes to my mind, it's not an African proverb, really,
No problem.
or at all. It's a quote from perhaps the most unlikely person that I would be quoting, or that I would expect myself to be quoting, but I saw this recently online. It's a quote that says, if somebody says no, then you're talking to the wrong person. And this is a quote by Kris Jenner, of the matriarch of the Kardashian empire.
Are you a big Kardashian fan?
No, I'm not at all. Not at all, actually. Which is why I chuckled to myself that I would be quoting Kris Jenner. However, I do have a lot of respect for what they built and definitely the grit of Kris Jenner towards that, and being a woman in the media space. In that sense, I do draw inspiration from.
Very much
what
so.
She's done. Yeah.
No, I agree 100%. It's a great quote as well. Not one that I've heard before, but it's a very, very good quote. And as you said, it's all about resilience, not giving up, keep on going.
Exactly.
If you have an idea and you firmly believe in that idea, you need to just be very dogged about it and just keep fighting until you get to where you need to get.
Yes, exactly.
As we're coming to the close of the conversation, do you have any closing remarks, final calls to action for people who are interested in African podcasting or Africa Podfest and the work that you guys do?
Yes, for sure. Follow at Africa Podfest across all social media and visit our website, which is africapodcastfestival.com, to book your tickets Africa Podcast Day, which is on February 12th in 2023. It's in person and there's also a virtual ticket, so no excuses. Travel is not an excuse for missing it. And then for everybody listening to the Unlock Africa podcast, keep believing and keep betting on yourself because Africa has so much to offer. And this is where it's at.
Thank you. That was a fantastic way to finish today's conversation. It's been a fresh, fascinating, engaging conversation. As an African podcaster, it's great to have you on the show as you are leading the way, highlighting the importance and also the growing authority of African podcasts. You know, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today, and thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I've also really enjoyed myself in this conversation. I've enjoyed connecting with you, and I can't wait for the episode to brag about it.
Brilliant. And I look forward to future collaborations as well. So definitely, it's been brilliant connecting and having you on the podcast.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bye. Take care.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.